So I have the great pleasure to introduce Nick Ellsmore, who is the head of global strategy for Trustwave, strategy consulting, cybersecurity. You're a very senior guy. Thanks, Nick, for finding the time to chat with me today.
Thanks, David. Glad to be here.
So before we jump in, I've been on your LinkedIn page and I've noticed that you are a veteran in the cybersecurity space, but you have a tremendous background in an area where people are familiar with, but not quite intimately familiar with. So, and I'm referring to buyout, mergers and acquisitions, so on. You've been through a couple. So, why don't you just, if you don't mind, just provide a glimpse of what that was like. How you started your career and so on, just so we can get to know you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I sort of fell in love with cybersecurity pretty much when I was at school and also at uni. And so, obviously, this is a couple of decades plus ago, and so it was very much a sort of early part of the industry. My first real exposure to it was actually looking at the legal and regulatory framework around encryption. And so this is back in the days where encryption was considered a munition, and there were all the debates about whether or not you can send floppy disks containing encryption source code overseas, or is that exporting weapons? And like I just found the whole thing fascinating. And from that, really got pretty heavily involved in sort of learning about cybersecurity policy regulation. And it was back at the time when this is sort of 99, 2000. It was a pretty early stage sort of part of the industry. And then pretty much started my first cybersecurity business in fourth year of university. And then that company grew pretty quickly. I often say from a sort of timing and scale perspective, our first client was one of the big banks here in Australia. And the security team there was me as a consultant and one other guy named Rowan.
So hold on, Nick. I need to ask you, and I need to peel the onion a little bit for a couple of things.
Yeah,
Not a lot of people, open up a business in their fourth year of university. When I graduated university, all I could think about, like, how can I pay back my student loan? How can I find a good job? And it's typically with companies that of, like some brand names and so on. So,
sure.
what made you? So again, it's not trivial, to have that entrepreneurship spirit and be able to kind of dive into the deep end and do
Mm.
something like this.
Look, I was really fortunate. So I did a degree at uni, which was called a co-op program degree. So effectively, it was a 4 year degree, and within that 4 years, there were three 6 month blocks where you actually did full time industry placements. And the first one that I did was with a really small management consulting company. So, and by really small, I mean like 6 people,
Mhm.
including me. And the guy that ran that, guy called Alan Jackson, who's a good friend of mine, ultimately became sort of my first mentor, I guess. And and just really gave me the confidence that it was possible. So he gave me my own projects and let me work on things. And this is when I was in second year of uni, so I really didn't know very much, but kind of had the raw capability to just work through it. And at the end of it, the decision for me was because at the end of uni, I applied for jobs. I applied for McKinsey, BCG, Boom, but Booz, Bain, all the
Mhm.
strategy consulting firms, which was what I thought I wanted. And in discussions with Alan and others, basically looked at it and went, look, at the moment, I have no costs, I have no living expenses, I have no family, I have no real obligations. Start a company, the whole thing fails and catches fire. I go back to the workforce at 21 instead of 20. What difference does it make? So I gave it a shot.
Yeah, that's totally amazing, and it's I think it's one of those things that they tell people, new graduates especially, just try, try, try. This as you mentioned, you have your opportunity cost is fairly low, and therefore you can afford to, as you mentioned, crash and burn.
Yeah.
But in your particular case, you didn't crash and burn, right? What happened?
Yeah, so we grew. I mean, it was slow at first because when you're starting a company at that age, particularly a sort of consulting and services business, really for the first few years, you're just establishing credibility. Every client is basically just an opportunity to learn and also to basically try and make sure you over deliver so that it sort of becomes self-fulfilling. I think it was about 3 years in that we got our first employee. And interestingly, employee number one back then was my co-founder in my second business, which I'll talk about in a moment, which ultimately is the one that was acquired by Trustwave. And so, so that company, we kept growing, did a couple of acquisitions and mergers along the way, and then ultimately sold that company to BAE Systems in 2010, and then stayed on for a couple of years. Then took a few years off and actually did M&A advisory work. So basically sell-side advisory for other cybersecurity companies looking to exit. And then in 2015, started another security professional services firm called Hivint with Craig, who was employee number one back at SIFT. And we built that up and then sold that to Trustwave at the end of 2018.
Wow. So what did Craig, I'm sure he was doing something at a time as well. Did you just like call him up? Hey, Craig, do you want to do this again?
Yeah, so after I and a couple of the other early founders of the first business left, so Craig was basically running everything at BAE Systems.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we were keen to find an opportunity to work together again. So it was good.
So when you decide to go and create a professional business, professional services business, it's not trivial. It's not normally people think startup in cybersecurity. They think product side. They think, okay, how can we make a platform? Or at least today, they're like, how do we make a SaaS platform that solves a problem? Professional services is a slightly different animal because the multiples are not the same, and there's accountability. There's some skill set that's really hard to come by. Why did you specifically decide to kind of pursue that particular venue?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I know. So I'm also an advisor to Bugcrowd, and sort of Casey, who's the founder of Bugcrowd, was I guess a sort of colleague of mine, not working in the same company, but very closely in the same industry. Going back a decade or more. And Bugcrowd is very much the raise capital, grow really hyper fast. And really, look to take a significant part of the market. Whereas the businesses that I actually know much better and my personal experience, which is in the consulting side, is really, relationship based. It's much more, competing with the sort of Deloittes and the PwCs, where we don't have salespeople. It's just everyone's a consultant, everyone's a cybersecurity specialist, everyone's an expert. If you phone us up, the person that answers the phone is going to be someone who is genuinely an expert in the field. And so everything that we do is just, it's sort of knowledge based, it's expertise based, it's being involved in conferences, it's being, doing research and writing white papers. And I guess that way of building a business, which is do good work, build good relationships, add value to the community, is I guess just what I'm most comfortable with and most familiar with. So ultimately, that's what we pursued.
And these are kind of solid, it's very just solid fundamentals, right? Do good
Yeah,
work.
there's no need to overcomplicate it. As I say, I mean, the way that so I mean, with Hivint, the second company, we got to the stage from a growth perspective after less than 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
That was the same that it took us kind of 10 to 12 years the first time around. And the reason that we could grow so much faster is, one, we actually had some credibility at that point, so people would take our calls. But we were also just much more aggressive. So we were much more confident that we could hire ahead of the curve, we could bring people on. There was, it's still a supply side constrained market. And when we come to talking about, supply chain risk and all of those pieces, this is really, for me, like one of the biggest sort of macro themes through our whole industry is ultimately there just aren't enough people. And so you need to find ways to solve the fact that there aren't enough people. And there are, two or three things you can do there. One is you can, build out managed services that allow you to get a sort of multiple. So basically you can leverage the people that you have into servicing more clients, or you can go to another organization that has the people that you need, which is effectively the consulting and professional services model, which is just providing those bodies, or you can invest in a mechanism to build and train that workforce yourself. But you have to do one of those three things or some combination of all of them. And that goes for everything from supply chain security through to literally everything in cybersecurity from my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's also interesting. So there's two things. There's not enough people, and then it seems like we're getting more complex from an environmental, like system and integration perspective. And then the attack surface is almost infinitely large. We're not just the end users, but the entire supply chain, which we're going to dive a little deeper into now. And now you're part of a larger company. Trustwave is a serious business with different product line and so on. So how was that transition for you specifically?
Yeah, and I think the benefit that we had was having done this once before. So having gone through the process of sort of selling our first business, we went in with eyes open when we were really looking at the sale of Hivint, and really making sure that the organisation we were going to become a part of was going to be able to take what we'd built and really do more with it than we could. Obviously, consulting is very hard to grow internationally in terms of sort of starting a small business and then building it and then growing it internationally. But the opportunity that Trustwave gave us is, really to take what we built, both in Hivint and also in our platform business, Security Colony. You mentioned before the need for a SaaS platform. We do have that. And be able to take those and really make them available in other markets, and to be able to grow a lot more quickly than we would be able to just on our own, just organically.
Yeah, and you have kind of the backbone for larger business with infrastructure, with the support that you require to grow that business. And I'm assuming you were able to then focus more on the things you really cared about, which was these services that you wanted to tailor fit these customers. And so you talked a lot to your customer facing today. You talk a lot, to customers. And when out of your conversation you had with customers and potential customers for the past, 3 to 6 months, do you see any particular trends or things that you feel are not being taken care of or are top of mind right now for cybersecurity executives?
I think at the moment, most things are being addressed. I think that the challenge at the moment is there's just so much. There's just so much noise, and it's probably unfair to say that we lurch from crisis to crisis, but certainly ransomware becomes an issue when it's a really big issue. Certainly, there's a huge amount that's still happening in the regulatory space as well. I know here in Australia, we're currently looking at new critical infrastructure security regulation, which could change the obligations of organisations quite significantly.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at things like mandatory reporting of ransomware attacks, and I think that regulatory piece is going to change the dynamic very quickly. I mean, we saw that with mandatory data breach reporting. I think it's just going to keep adding on over and over again. But the challenge for me with the regulation is it's not necessarily focused on the thing that is most important for the organization. It's focused on what is most important at a sort of macro level. Mm-hmm. But at any individual organization's level, it actually may not be where they should be focusing their attention in terms of a pure sort of security perspective.
So that's so interesting that what you mentioned now, and I think you're spot on. And I also think that some of these regulations are a bit ambiguous in the sense that they're,
They have to be.
They're the way to interpret them are might be slightly different from vertical to vertical, and also the type of customer, the type of company you are, and so on. How do you advise then customers? Just when you said to them, okay, I know there's a regulatory environment you have to comply with, but here are the kind of the other things you need to worry about, and oh, by the way, this is how I interpret these regulations, and here's how to go about to be in compliant.
Yeah, so I think the key thing, again, going back over the last 20 something years of advising organizations and helping to build out strategies and roadmaps and plans and everything else, is the key thing is really starting with risk. And I know we've said that for a long time, but every now and then we need to kind of refresh the message and go back to it again, which is, what are the risks we're actually trying to mitigate? Who are the organizations, who are the attackers that are most likely to be targeting us? What are they going to be, what are they going to be going after? How are they going to be doing it? And interestingly, a lot of the sort of regulatory frameworks now are starting to head in that direction. So things like the adversarial attack simulation type concept. I think there's regulation called ICAST in Hong Kong, the CBEST in the UK. We've got CORI here in Australia. All of them are basically heading down that path of saying, you need to actually go through a structured exercise of identifying who is really going to be targeting you and how would they be doing it, and then use that as the testing framework. And so I think that the more we can head towards that type of very realistic, very targeted and intentional sort of framework, we'll be better off. I think the challenge is it's easy to do that for kind of high value financial services organizations. It's much harder when you're trying to write a regulation that has to apply across, millions or tens of millions of small businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also very hard to quantify where the risk starts and where the risk ends, especially when a lot of companies now outsource, their the non-essential quote unquote business functions, right? So the definition of what is a company is a bit loose as well. I mean, where does a company start and where does a company end?
Yeah, and let alone, which country is a company regulated in? You've now got, if everything's sold online, all the businesses are on the internet. Where are you incorporated is kind of irrelevant these days. And a lot of the regulation that's being written is being written in a sort of extra jurisdictional, extrajudicial way, in the sense that, whether you're in Australia or the US or the UK, GDPR potentially still applies to you if you have customers that sort of fit into that category. So it can be pretty difficult to try and meet all of those requirements. And I guess that's why, again, going back to the risk piece, you have to start with the premise of, okay, let's just make sure that we're actually doing the right things. And if we're doing the right things, then we're probably going to be in a reasonable space when it comes to regulation and compliance.
Yeah, and I'm assuming as well that the kind of quantifying the risk is something that is not static. I mean, it has to be some sort of dynamic setup where you continuously look at what are the assets and who's after you, because that's changing as well, right?
It's never ending. Absolutely. I mean, the attack techniques, the attackers, and even from an organizational perspective, what you have to lose will change. I guess an interesting sort of thought experiment is is looking at advising really early stage companies. And the reason it's interesting is, for an early stage company, really the first thing they need to do is get customers. And so the debate is always, how much security do you need to put in from the very, very outset? And I know as a security purist, we would all like the answer to be like all security, all of the controls you could possibly put in place, you need to put them in place at the very outset. But it's not financially viable. That's not the way companies are built. That's not how things work. And so you need to then sort of go into this concept of you need to have almost minimum viable security to be able to get a company out the door, to be able to get a product out the door, to be able to get customers on board. But then as you go on your growth journey, at some point, your minimum viable security is no longer viable anymore. You now need to have a much higher level of security because you don't have 50 records. Now you have 50,000 records that you're protecting. And so for any organization, as they grow, the security that they, both from a sort of moral perspective to the market and also just from a sort of financial perspective that they need to have in place is going to continue to change and realistically is going to continue to escalate most of the time.
So MVS, just like
MVS, absolutely.
like a
That's what we talk
MVP.
about.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yep.
And I believe that eventually it's almost going to be a necessity. I mean, the first enterprise client that would require, an assessment and review of their security controls, whether it's, CIS or SOC 2, whatever the case may be, will force them to, to get to on par with the rest of the industry, whether they want it or
Yeah,
not.
absolutely. And that's in many ways it's partly the regulation side, but it's actually more the contract side that's actually forcing organizations down the path of implementing security controls. So it's effectively their big clients saying, hey, you may or may not be subject to this regulation, but if you want our money, here's what you're going to do. And that's what we see the key driver as.
It's always, follow the money. It's like, it's
Yeah,
funny that
exactly.
it's with this transaction on the line. It's amazing how many forces are at play all of a sudden.
Yeah, and I mean the interesting thing is how often we see organizations who come to us and say, hey, we just signed a contract so that we could win the work, saying that we're going to be ISO 27001 accredited. What does that involve? Yeah, you probably should
so
have had that chat before you signed the contract.
so maybe they read some startup book somewhere. Said, say yes first, and then
Yeah,
ask for
exactly.
forgiveness
Yeah,
later.
figure it out. Yeah,
Figure out later.
what could go wrong?
What can go wrong? Um, so tell me a bit about what are you doing currently for supply chain risk? You came out with a new program to assist your customers in defending that tremendous attack surface, and it seems like it's becoming a almost like a not even newsworthy because it's like it's every other Monday you hear a company that got attacked, but specifically by one of its suppliers. We even heard like just the other day there was a company that had their VC leak information on their customers because they provided it as part
Yeah,
of their fundraising.
yeah.
So what are you currently doing to help customers protect themselves?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, supply chain risk has been one of the most interesting parts of security for many years, going all the way back to the RSA breach and Lockheed Martin and things back in 2011, I think that was. So that's a decade ago now. But there are sort of two different levels that we look at this. And the first level is there's a strategic side. So we've built out what we call a diagnostic service around supply chain risk. And that basically looks at how organizations go through the process of identifying who their suppliers are, which is often a non-trivial exercise, and then triaging that list because that list can run to tens of thousands of organizations at times. And then so triaging that, figuring out which ones are high risk, which are medium, which are low risk, and they're basically putting them through different funnels of assessment to make sure that it's all being managed appropriately. That's at the strategic side. And then at the operational side, we've actually built out a service called Managed Vendor Risk Assessment, which is built on the findings platform. And that actually does the execution of the process. So having gone through that triage and you end up dropping out that there are 600 high risk suppliers, 2,000 medium risk suppliers, and so on, you then just got to get through the process of turning the handle on all of those assessments. But you have to get it done in a way that is consistent, that is repeatable, and ultimately that is scalable, because trying to do that many assessments is just an unworkable process if you're trying to do that by emailing out an Excel spreadsheet. And so ultimately the managed vendor risk assessment process is about that piece.
And it's amazing that the kind of step number one is really creating an inventory. Building that
Yeah.
inventory. It almost sounds like too basic. But it seems like it's not trivial. Again, as you mentioned, there might be you know suppliers that don't even know about, because they're suppliers and then suppliers of their supplier, right? So the third party end party. Uh, you know,
Even just the first order, even just the direct suppliers of an organization are often not known, for a whole range of reasons. I mean, if you look, I guess, as an example, because the last 18 months, the pandemic days, have really sort of highlighted a lot of these issues. In that, when the pandemic first hit and everyone quickly snapped to work from home, um, at that point, there were a heap of processes within any organization that were not designed to support that model. They just didn't work. You needed to get files to people, you needed to share information, you needed to have calls, whatever else. And there may not have been a process for doing that securely. And so the first decision that had to be made was, do we go through our normal procurement process and take a few months and get the right solution in place, or do we keep the business running and just everyone do what you have to do, make decisions you have to make, onboard suppliers you have to onboard, so that we can keep the business running? And of course, all organizations chose that latter approach, which meant that you had, credit cards flying around the place with people basically just buying new suppliers, onboarding new suppliers, to just keep the wheels turning. And so there's just a lot of suppliers, a lot of organizations people don't actually realize that they work with.
yeah, and also the whole process of supply chain, third party risk. I mean, it's been around for a long time, right? So if
Mm,
you the majority of organizations have some process in place, whether they use a ERP or some mechanism that they've on board. But there are issues there, as you mentioned, aside from the pandemic, there were issues that don't lend themselves to the situation that is today, like the rapid life cycle of new vendors, the inherent risk associated with doing business with vendors that you have no control over, and so on. So that the whole process was, very manual and subjective, right? Is that correct? Most organizations do it like completely by hand, quote unquote, just by virtue of like collecting evidence and so on.
yeah, well, I mean, we prior to having the MBRA service in place, we certainly delivered a large number of reviews effectively manually, and often manually using the process that our clients had in place, because they had an established process and said, here, this is what we need you to follow. And the fascinating thing is, how widely that varies. It varies from a questionnaire that literally takes days to fill out, through to a couple of check boxes that take a few minutes. And yet, both those organizations think that they're doing what is necessary. I mean, obviously, no one would spend more time or more effort on them than they thought they had to. They're just interpreting it really, really differently.
Yeah, and also the nature of the business velocity of how things move today. You can onboard a vendor that may be a in quote unquote low category for you, no low risk, but very quickly can all of a sudden become a major partner, right? Because again, things are moving so
Yes.
quickly. You can see that now with businesses taking ownership. For example, decided that they they take ownership over shipping because of all the issues with shipping, global shipping. So all of a sudden they either acquire or decide to partner with a shipping company, but they become essentially part of their business like almost overnight. So things are really dynamic in that regards, right?
Yeah, and I think the key thing there is the supply chain risk issue crosses over obviously between cybersecurity and procurement and all of the sort of procurement functions within an organization. And the procurement functions historically haven't been built with this concept in mind. And so, you might set out to establish a partner relationship and establish a master services agreement with a client that allows you to procure, a whole raft of different services from an organization. But when you go and do the supply chain risk assessment, the security assessment, you may only be looking at the very, very first piece of that engagement, as in the very first thing. You might be running a proof of concept for only 1,000 users. The data all might be held onshore and everything else. But the MSA might contemplate a whole much broader range of services. And then in 6 months' time, when you start adding on other parts to that agreement, you start building on the size of the engagement with the supplier, it's pretty rare that actually triggers a subsequent security review of an organization, which is how you end up with this situation where an organization or a supplier that was assessed as being fine is now actually delivering services that are just way out of the scope of what was ever intended.
Right. So you are now delivering, this, third party risk review is a managed service, right? So you're
Correct.
essentially solving, the cardinal issue with the not just the collection of evidence, but the reviewing of it and finding the gaps and mapping it to specific risk categories and risk frameworks and so on. Um, what within the kind of the findings platform did you I'm assuming again Trustwave is a big organization. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are knocking on your door, requesting that you partner with them. What specifically did you like about findings?
Yeah, so I think the key thing for us was really the flexibility, and the fact that we could actually build in our process, build in our IP and our logic and things into the platform, so that we effectively get the best of both worlds, in the sense that we get the automation, the consistency of the process, the sort of smoothness of the engagement, but we also can still execute on our process. So we can execute on the IP that we've built, the questions that we need to ask, and the evidence we need to ask for, so that we can go through that process of completing the assessment consistently and end up with what, from our perspective, is a good balance between the amount of effort that needs to go into assessing suppliers and yet something that is reasonable enough to be able to scale. And the other interesting one is that it's reasonable enough that suppliers engage with it, because you'd be surprised how big an issue it is. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but how big an issue it is that the non-response rate is enormous. I mean, if you send a supplier a questionnaire that's going to take hours for them to complete, there is a significant number of suppliers who just won't engage.
Yeah, the human element of it is not trivial at all, as you mentioned.
Mm.
So you managed to build a repetitive, robust process, which it sounds like you're just basically using the findings as a platform, but you had basically the entire process laid out. They're just using the platform to, streamline it and create like more of automated solution. But it sounds like you, because of your expertise you had dealing with customers in the past, you mostly had the whole process already down path, and you just use the platform as a tool to almost like amplify that. Right? Is that correct?
Yeah, to a degree, but there's also obviously all the benefits of things like centralized reporting, the ability to actually do reporting across across time and across big sort of cohorts of organizations, and also the fact that a lot of the sort of standards and other material is already built into the platform, means that it does give us that option where if the client says they want to go down a particularly different path, we can accommodate that as well. So it's really the flexibility of the system that works really well for us.
And Nick, I'm assuming that when you engage customers, uh, they don't necessarily know what they don't know, right? They probably do a only partial review of their suppliers. So are they surprised when you go through an assessment and all of a sudden they find that they have more suppliers than they thought they had, and then additionally, the suppliers that they did not review actually have some issues?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think most organisations have a pretty good level of self-awareness about the issue.
Hmm.
I think that they know that there are a lot of suppliers that they may not have visibility of for a whole range of reasons. Um, a simple example that I often give is we often see a procurement process that for efficiency's sake will effectively have dollar value thresholds that determine which process something goes down. So if you're spending $50, then you don't need to send that supplier to get a cybersecurity assessment. But if you're spending $500,000, then you do. But the sort of perverse outcome that creates is if you can get something that costs not very much, then you can actually circumvent a lot of the process. Risk is not really determined by how much you spend on the product or the service. Risk is determined by what data you're giving them, what access you're giving them, and
Yeah.
everything else. But that may not be the question that's driving that decision in the procurement process. And so you end up with a lot of situations like that where products that are being given to organizations for free, things that are low cost, and a
It's
whole raft of other
it's
things don't
yeah,
work.
it's so interesting. So it means that you can potentially be, as you mentioned, low cost, service or product
Yeah,
with
and
very
you
high
never get
risk.
assessed. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
very high
Which is,
risk.
and we see that all the time in parts of financial services and investment banking, where effectively you will have someone give you these systems for free
Yeah,
because
just to
what
get the
you actually,
clout.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
or just because the funding or the payment model is actually just done through sort of clipping transactions on the back end. So there's no upfront cost, which means there's no real procurement obligation to get them assessed.
So it's almost like a loophole. Like that would not show
Yeah,
up
absolutely.
on the radar screen. That's so interesting. And then when you find when you review these gaps, how do you then close the loop on it? How do you assist the clients? Because I'm assuming again there's a lot of expertise required to figure out what are the top issues that needs to be fixed now, right now, and then some which are not. Like again, it's prioritization in terms of risk. How do you then assist the clients to
Yeah.
help them close the loop on it?
So it's interesting. From my perspective, one of my sort of core principles when looking at anything in security is there's two different things you're looking at. One is let's stop things getting worse, and then there's let's deal with what currently exists. And so the first piece of that, which is let's stop things getting worse, is really about let's look at the process. Let's make sure that we stop introducing new suppliers that haven't been assessed. Let's fix the process so that things go through the right assessment process. When you then go back to looking at what's currently in place, I mean ultimately it's there are any number of pretty well regarded sort of mechanisms for assessing the sort of priority of organizations or the risk that comes with a supplier relationship. And usually you're looking at aspects like, how much data do they have access to? How much access do they have to your organization? How critical are they to your business? And one or two other things. And realistically, if you just rate the suppliers on that kind of scale, you can pretty quickly drop out a list of the suppliers that are going to be the most significant risk and the others that are going to be much lower risk. And then it's really just a case of starting at the most significantly risky, and then working down the list from there.
Interesting. So what do you do? I'm assuming that every time there's a new announcement about like a solar wind or anything like that, I'm assuming you get phone calls, requesting advice and so on. How do you then determine who within the supply chain is vulnerable for something like that?
Yeah, and that's actually a really good and really important sort of discussion topic, which is the way I split sort of supply chain risk. I actually split it into three broad buckets, and they're very broad buckets. The first is geopolitical risk, and geopolitical risk is, do you trust the environment in which a technology or a product is created, and therefore do you trust that product? And this is a lot of the discussion that happens about, data,
It,
about sovereignty and
yeah, it can be a pretty loaded question depending on, again, who
oh,
you ask.
100%, 100%. And then the next one is the sort of typical supplier security. So this is your, your lawyers, your consultants, your cloud service providers, your, whoever else. So how secure are they, and what is the likelihood that they're going to have a security issue and potentially lose your data? That's the piece that's really the big bit of the supply chain security assessment process, because that's the part that the process is best designed for. The piece that you just mentioned, which is the sort of SolarWinds scenario, is around the technology componentry itself. Now, the reality is no questionnaire that you can ask is really going to be able to identify the likelihood that an organization could be subject to product tampering by a nation state, because the sophistication or the potential sophistication of that attack is so high that if you could just have a question that says, do you have a risk of being tampered with by a nation state? Yes, no, yes. But it doesn't work like that. So with that type of breach, you actually have to acknowledge the fact that just may happen. That is a risk, that is a real risk to your organization. It should have already been on your risk register after the RSA compromise in 2011. We know this happens. We know that core infrastructure providers are targeted by nation states. We can't pretend that that's a surprise. The fact that everyone was so surprised at SolarWinds is itself problematic, because it just means we've forgotten everything that happened over the last 10 years. But the way you have to pick that up is through actually just monitoring the behavior of your environments. So you're not going to be able to stop the fact that you can get a piece of hardware that has been tampered with, but you should be able to detect the malicious activity when that device starts communicating with things it shouldn't communicate with, when there's lateral movement within the network and that type of thing. So that's much more a detect and response.
Yeah, and I remember when it first came about, it created this shockwave, and a lot of news and people talk about it, and all the vendors out there were like, okay, you got to buy our stuff because now SolarWind is out there, and you need to protect yourself. And then it kind of died down until the next big thing hits.
Yeah.
But in terms of, you mentioned specifically breach notification, that's something that is coming down the pipe in regulatory format. Um, what in your opinion is kind of the best way to to basically create that compliancy around breach notification specifically for supply chain?
Yeah, so that's actually a really, really good question as well. So one of my sort of core messages with supply chain security is suppliers are not the enemy. It's very easy to go through this process, go, no, suppliers are risky, suppliers are going to cause me to have security incidents, suppliers are scary and bad, and I need to just manage them. Like I need to, put controls on them and put requirements on them and obligations and everything else. And that really makes it hard to do business ultimately. It sort of impacts on the relationships that you have with those organizations, but also I sometimes talk about supply chain security as a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is there are very, very few organizations who are not both a consumer of supplier services and a supplier to other organizations. And so, anything that you put on your suppliers as a requirement, you have to expect that all of your customers are going to put on you as well. And so, there's an obligation, there's an incentive on all of us to be reasonable in the processes we put in place. So coming back to your question about breach notification, one of the key things that I really advocate is work with your suppliers and actually help them. If your suppliers are that important to your business that you really need, that you're entrusting them with sensitive data, that you're giving them sensitive access, then why wouldn't you actually invest in helping them with their security? So some of the best practices that we have seen and that we help organizations with is, for example, actually building out a breach notification or an incident response process that you can actually provide to your suppliers, so that you actually provide them a way into your organization, so that if they have an incident, they don't feel like they need to sort of hide it from you, but you've actually built a process that invites them, that engages them to come in. People are sort of resistant to notify organizations because at the moment it's very much perceived as being a negative. And obviously security incidents are a negative in some ways, but equally a lot of the time they're a criminal act that someone has done against you as an organization. And I think as society, we do need to move past the point where we're sort of victim blaming all the time. It's notwithstanding the fact that people need to make sure they still do the right things, but we can't always blame the victim.
Yeah, totally. It has to be like a mind shift,
Yeah,
for more collaborative, kind of work around security notification, so on. We definitely know the adversaries are collaborating, so we should do that as well, and take down the barriers for that as well. But what you mentioned is also really interesting, because you see that happening out of necessity, where a large organization with the resources, to provide the technology and know-how, sometimes deal with a supplier's like mom and pop shop, but it's critical to their business,
exactly.
and they have to, if something happens or they need to fix it, they have to provide that service to that supplier, because otherwise they're on their own, they're not going to be able to fix it, right? So it's sort of
Yeah,
you
and
know,
there are some really, really interesting groups of organizations like that. So, for example, in Australia, we have this situation where we'll have large financial services companies who will have a financial services license, and then they'll have a whole bunch of licensee financial advisors. And those financial advisors, as you say, they're literally thousands of very small businesses, between kind of 2 and 20 staff. And the ability of those businesses to respond to a security incident is, it's near zero. Um, but for the large financial services company, there's an exposure there, in that if they don't help those companies to actually manage that risk, then potentially, everyone's going to look bad at the end. So, really the incentive is for the sort of central group, for the financial services organization, to actually invest in building out some of those processes, helping with security awareness training, really just take more of an ownership and a leadership role in actually helping to sort of raise the security maturity of that whole group of organizations.
yeah, excellent. And kind of last question before I let you go. So where are we heading? We covered quite a bit, and you're laughing, but you know where I'm going with this is
Mm,
like, we continuously see regulatory environment is ever changing, and it's like a catch up. Uh, Even GDPR was, how many years ago it's been in force, right? We're talking about
yeah,
quite a few now, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so there's always this constant catch up, and then, as you mentioned, it's becoming more complex, because there's no, from a geographically speaking, there's no like a standalone organization that only does business, let's say, in New York, or in the US or Australia or Canada for that matter. um, and it's becoming, and then this supply chain, the nth party, almost becoming like a perfect storm, and then all these other regulatory, like, like a um, ESG, maybe diversity. There's just, it's almost like, the SMBs never have a chance, or medium-sized businesses don't have a chance to be in compliance due to the nature of becoming compliance and running a business. There's so much overhead. So where do you think? And again, it's a fine balance between allowing businesses to strive and be successful, and then also limiting or providing some sort of like environment where there's some sort of review of that business, so it's they're not kind of running wild.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for me, sorry, it's just some bolt of light coming through and changing my lighting.
It's becoming a little dramatic. It's
Yeah,
good. Looks good.
exactly. I've got a window. So, I mean, again,
Perfect
I go
timing, by the
back
way.
to I go back to a lot of these sort of core principles, and one of the core principles that I do believe in is, you need to make the secure way the easy way. And in many ways, you actually need to remove security decision making authority from organizations who aren't actually in a good place to make those decisions. And so what I think that looks like in practice when we play that out is that organizations actually start consuming secured services so that they actually have less of a role in the process. It is ridiculous that we're still in a situation that someone gets an email, clicks on the wrong link, and they compromise their system and lose their data. Like that just shouldn't be a thing. And we can do all the awareness training in the world to try to stop people from clicking on that link. It's not going to happen. People are always going to click on that link. The only way that gets solved is if at a technical level, clicking on that link no longer causes them that bad outcome. And so effectively, I think where this all leads is, centralized services, more sort of complete cloud service provision that ultimately removes more of the security burden from smaller organizations who just aren't in a position to be able to carry that burden.
Absolutely, Nick, and this is this is why MSSPs and service providers like yourself are the fastest growing segments in security. I mean, aside from the big enterprise, who can afford to run a SOC like 24/7 or be compliant to all the auditors and the regular. I mean,
Yeah.
it's never ending. So
Yeah, and again, it goes back to that message at the very start, which is that a lot of this, from my perspective, in fact, almost all of this comes back to the skills shortage. It comes back to a lack of people in the industry, and certainly managed service providers are in a good position to help try and sort of provide some leverage to help support that.
Nick, it's been absolutely awesome to have you and have this conversation today. I know that things are looking up and up in Australia, so maybe we'll see you in New York sometime soon. I know you're probably itching to travel, no, or maybe not. I
Yeah,
mean,
I think first of November supposedly we can leave the country. So yeah, maybe sometime soon.
so until then, Nick, thank you very much for taking the time.